I'm going to read you chapter 1 of The Ruby and the Smoke. This online version has quite an elaborate introduction with all of the chapters, and you have to scroll down to get to this point. So do bear that in mind. And the eye at the top of the page changes your background from white to black, and I found that easier to read, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You don't have to follow along with this text. You can look at it yourself and just listen to me, or you can read it by yourself, either way. Okay, The Ruby and the Smoke by Philip Pullman, Chapter 1, The Seven Blessings. On a cold, fretful afternoon in early October 1872, a hansom cab drew up outside the offices of Lockhart and Selby, shipping agents in the financial heart of London, and a young girl got out and paid the driver. She was a person of 16 or so, alone and uncommonly pretty. She was slender and pale and dressed in mourning, and with a black bonnet under which she tucked back a straying twist of blonde hair that the wind had teased loose. She had unusually dark brown eyes for one so fair. Her name was Sally Lockhart, and within 15 minutes she was going to kill a man. She stood looking up at the building for a moment and climbed the 3 steps and entered. There was a drab corridor facing her, with a porter's office on the right, where an old man sat in front of a fire reading a penny dreadful. She tapped on the glass and he sat up guiltily, thrusting the magazine down beside his chair. "Beg pardon, miss," he said. "Didn't see you come in." "I've come to see Mr. Selby," she said, "but he wasn't expecting me." "Name, please, miss?" "My name is Lockhart. My father was Mr. Lockhart." He became friendlier at once. "Miss Sally, is it? You've been here before, miss." "Have I? I'm sorry, I don't remember. Must have been 10 years ago at least. You sat by my fire and had a ginger biscuit and told me all about your pony. You've forgotten already?" "Dear me, I was very sorry to hear about your father, miss. That was a terrible thing, the ship going down like that. He was a real gentleman, miss." "Yes, thank you. It was partly about my father that I came." "Is Mr. Selby in? Can I see him?" Oops. "Well, I'm afraid he ain't, miss. He's in the West India Docks on business. But Mr. Higgs is here, the company secretary. He'll be glad to talk to you." "Thank you. I'd better see him then." The porter rang a bell and a small boy appeared, like a sudden solidification of all the grime in the Cheapside air. His jacket was torn in 3 places, his collar had come adrift from the shirt, and his hair looked as if it had been used for an experiment with the powers of electricity. "What do you want?" said this apparition, whose name was Jim. "Mind your manners," said the porter. "Take this young lady up to see Mr. Higgs, and Smartish. This is Miss Lockhart." The boy's sharp eyes took her in for a moment, and then flicked back suspiciously to the porter. "You got my Union Jack," he said. "I seen you hide it when old Higgsy come in earlier." "I ain't," said the porter, without conviction. "Get on and do as you're told." "I'll have it," said the boy. "You wait. You ain't stealing my property." "Come on," he added to Sally, and withdrew. "You'll have to forgive him, Miss Lockhart," said the porter. "He weren't caught young enough to tame that one." "I don't mind," said Sally. "Thank you. I'll look in and say goodbye before I go." The boy was waiting for her at the foot of the staircase. "Was the boss your old man?" he said as they climbed. "Yes," she said, meaning to say more, but not finding the words. "He was a good bloke." It was a gesture of sympathy, she thought, and felt grateful. "Do you know anyone called Marchbanks?" she said. "Is there a Mr. Marchbanks who works here?" "No, never heard the name before." "Or, have you ever heard—" They were near the top of the stairs now, and she stopped to finish the question. "Have you ever heard of the 7 Blessings?" "Eh?" "Please," she said, "it's important." "No, I ain't," he said. "Sounds like a pub or summat. What is it?" "It's just something I heard. It's nothing. Forget it, please," she said, and moved up to the top of the stairs. "Where do I find Mr. Higgs?" "In here," he said, knocking thunderously at a panel door. Without waiting for an answer, he opened it and called, "Lady to see Mr. Higgs, name of Miss Lockhart." She entered and the door closed behind her. The room was a fog of smoke, cigar smoke, and an atmosphere of polished leather, mahogany, silver inkwells, drawers with brass handles and glass paperweights. A portly man was trying to roll up a large wall map on the other side of the room, and gleaming with effort, his pate gleamed. His boots gleamed. The Masonic seal on the heavy gold watch chain over his paunch gleamed, and his face was shiny with heat and red with years of wine and food. He finished rolling the map and looked up. His expression became solemn and pious. "Miss Lockhart, daughter of the late Miss Matthew Lockhart?" "Yes," she said. He spread out his hands. "My dear Miss Lockhart," he said, "I can only say how sorry, how truly sorry all of us were to hear of your sad loss. A fine man, a generous employer, a Christian gentleman, a gallant soldier, a great loss, a sad and tragic loss." She inclined her head. "You are very kind," she said, "but I wonder if I could ask you something." "My dear," he had become expansive and genial. He pulled out a chair for her and stood with his broad backside to the fire, beaming like an uncle. "Anything that is in my power will be done, I guarantee." "Well, it's not that I want anything done. It's simpler than that. It's just, well, did my father ever mention a Mr. Marchbanks? Do you know anyone of that name?" He appeared to consider it with great attention. "Marchbanks," he said, "Marchbanks. There's a ship's chandler in Rotherhithe called that, spelled Marjoribanks. You know, would that be the one? I don't recall your poor father ever having dealings with him, though." "It may be," said Sally. "Do you know his address?" "Tasmania Wharf, I believe," said Mr. Higgs. "Thank you. And there was something else. It sounds silly. I shouldn't be bothering you really, but my dear Miss Lockhart, anything that can be done will be done. Just tell me how I can help." "Well, have you ever heard the phrase, the 7 blessings? Then something extraordinary happened. Mr. Higgs was a large, well-fed man, as we have remarked. So perhaps it was not Sally's words so much as the years of port and Cuban cigars and rich dinners that preceded them, which made him crumple at the heart and gasp for air. He took a step forward, then darkness flooded his face. His hands clutched at his waistcoat, and he fell with a crash to the turkey carpet. One foot kicked and twitched 5 times hideously. His open eye was pressed to the carved clawfoot of the chair she sat in. She did not move, nor did she scream or faint. Her only actions were to draw back the hem of her dress from where it brushed the shiny dome of his skull, and to breathe deeply several times with her eyes shut. Her father had taught her this as a remedy for panic. He had taught her well. It worked. When she was calm again, she stood up carefully and stepped away from the body. Her mind was in turmoil, but her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. Good, she thought. When I'm frightened, I can rely on my hands. The discovery pleased her absurdly, and then she heard a loud voice in the corridor. "Samuel Selby, shipping agent. Got that?" it said. "No, Mr. Lockhart," said another voice more timidly. "There ain't no Mr. Lockhart. Mr. Lockhart's lying in 100 fathoms of water in the South China Sea, blast him. I mean, rest his soul. Paint him out, do you hear me? Paint him out, and I don't like green, a nice cheerful yellow for me, with them curly lines all round, stylish. Got that?" "Yes, Mr. Selby," was the reply. The door opened and the owner of the first voice came in. He was a short, stout man with a quiff of straw-coloured hair and ginger Dundreary whiskers that clashed unpleasantly with the high colour of his cheeks. He looked around and failed to see the body of Mr. Higgs, which was concealed from him by the broad mahogany desk. Instead, his fierce little eyes rested on Sally. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Who let you in?" "The porter," she said. "What's your name? What do you want?" "I'm Sally Lockhart, but—" "Lockhart?" He gave a low whistle. "Mr. Selby, Where's Higgs? He can deal with you. Higgs, come out here." "Mr. Selby, he's dead." He fell silent and saw where she was pointing, then came round the desk. "What's going on? When did this happen?" "A moment ago. We were talking and suddenly he fell. Perhaps his heart. Mr. Selby, may I sit down?" "Oh, go on then, damn fool. Not you, him. Why can't he have the decency to die on his own floor? I suppose he is dead. Have you looked?" "I don't think he can still be alive." Mr. Selby hauled the body aside and peered into the dead man's eyes, which stared unpleasantly upwards. Sally said nothing. "Dead as mutton," said Mr. Selby. "I have to call the police now, I suppose. Blast it. What did you want here, anyway?" They packed up all your father's stuff and sent it off to the lawyer. There ain't nothing here for you. Something prompted Sally to be careful. She took out a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. I just wanted to see my father's office, she said. Mr. Selby grunted suspiciously and opened the door and yelled downstairs for the porter to call a policeman. A clerk passing the open door with an armful of ledgers looked in. Craning his neck, Sally stood up. May I leave now? Not likely, said Mr. Selby. You're a witness, you are. You'll have to have your name and address took and turn up at the inquest. What do you want to see the office for, anyway? Sally sniffed loudly and dabbed more extravagantly at her eyes. She wondered if she might venture a sob. She wanted to be away and to think, and she was beginning to be afraid of this fierce little man's curiosity. If mentioning the 7 blessings had really killed Mr. Higgs, she had no wish to risk Mr. Selby's reaction. But the crying was a good idea. Mr. Selby was not subtle enough to suspect it, and waved her away in distaste. Oh, go on and sit in the porter's room, he said impatiently. The corporal wants a word with you, but there's no point in hanging about here snivelling. Go on downstairs. She left. On the landing, 2 or 3 clerks had gathered and stared after her with great curiosity. In the porter's room, she found the office boy reclaiming his penny dreadful from behind the postbox. It's all right, he said. I won't give you away. I heard you kill old Higgsy, but I ain't going to tell him. I didn't, she said. Of course you did. I heard through the door. You were listening? That's horrible. I didn't mean to. I felt tired all of a sudden, so I leant against the door, and somehow the words seemed to come through, he said with a grin. He died of fright, old Higgsy. Struck dead with terror. Whatever 7 blessings is, he knew all right. You better be careful who you ask about it. She sat down in the porter's chair. I just don't know what to do, she said. Do about what? She looked at his bright eyes and determined face and decided to trust him. It's this, she said. It arrived this morning. She opened her bag and took out a crumpled letter. It was posted from Singapore. That was the last place my father was before the ship sank, but it's not his writing. I don't know who it's from. Now, this letter does appear in the book. It doesn't appear in this version. So what I've done is I've taken a screenshot of the letter and I've uploaded it to Moodle. So you will be able to take a look at the actual letter. Jim opened it. The letter said, Blimey, he said. Tell you what, he can't spell. What do you mean? My name? What's your name? Sally. No, this. He pointed to the word Chatham. What should it be? Do you know it? C-H-A-T-A-H-A-M. Of course, Chatham in Kent. I suppose it could be. And this Marchbanks lives there. Betcha. That's why he's put it in. Here, he said, seeing Sally glance upwards. You don't want to worry about old Higgsy, because if you hadn't said it to him, somebody else would have, eventually. He was guilty of something, 100 to 1, and old Selby is too. You ain't said anything to him. Sally shook her head. Only to you, but I don't even know your name. Jim Taylor, and if you wants to find me, it's 13 Fortune Buildings, Clerkenwell. I'll help you. Will you really? You bet. Well, if you hear anything, write to me care of Mr. Temple of Lincoln's Inn. The door opened and the porter came in. Are you all right, miss? He said. What a terrible thing. Here you, he said to Jim, stop skulking in here. The copper wants a doctor sent for to certify the death. Go on, hop it and find a doctor. Jim winked at Sally and left. The porter went straight for the postbox and cursed when he found nothing behind it. Young blackguard, he muttered. I might have known it. Would you like a cup of tea, miss? I don't suppose Mr. Selby thought of that, did he? No, thank you. I ought to be going. My aunt will be getting anxious. Did the policeman want to see me? I expect he will in a minute. He'll come down here when he wants you. How was it that Mr. Higgs... We were talking about my father, said Sally, and he suddenly... Weak heart, said the porter. My brother was took the same last Christmas. He ate a big dinner and lit a cigar and fell down, face down, in a bowl of nuts. Oh, I beg your pardon, miss. I don't mean to dwell on it. Excuse me. Sally shook her head. Presently the policeman came and took her name and address and then left. She stayed a minute or two longer with the old porter. but remembering Jim's warning, she said nothing to him about the letter from the East Indies, which was a pity because he might have been able to tell her something. So it was not Sally's intention to kill, despite the gun she carried in her bag. The real cause of Mr. Higgs' death, the letter, had arrived only that morning, forwarded by the lawyer to the house in Peveril Square, Islington, where Sally was living. The house belonged to a distant relative of her father's, a grim widow called Mrs. Rees. Sally had been living there since August, and she was unhappy about it, but she had no choice. Mrs. Rees was her only living relative. Her father had died 3 months before, when the schooner Lavinia had sunk in the South China Sea. He had gone out there to look into some odd discrepancies in the reports from the company's agents in the Far East, something that had to be investigated on the spot and could not be checked from London. He had warned her before he went that it might be dangerous. "I want to speak to our man in Singapore," he had said. "He's a Dutchman called Van Eden. I know he's trustworthy. If by some chance I don't come back, he'll be able to tell you why." "Couldn't you send someone else?" "No, it's my firm and I must go myself." "But father, you must come back." "Of course I will, but you must be prepared for anything else. I know you'll do it bravely. Keep your powder dry, my girlie, and think of your mother." Sally's mother had died during the Indian Mutiny 15 years before, shot through the heart by a sepoy's rifle, at the same instant that a bullet from the pistol killed him. Sally was a few months old, their only child. Her mother had been a wild, stormy, romantic young woman who rode like a Cossack, shot like a champion, and smoked, to the scandal of the fascinated regiment, tiny black cheroots in an ivory holder. She was left-handed, which was why she was holding the pistol in her left hand, which was why she was clasping Sally with the right, which was why the bullet that struck her heart missed the baby, but it grazed her little arm and left a scar. Sally could not remember her mother, but she loved her, and since then she had been brought up by her father, oddly in the view of various busybodies. But then Captain Matthew Lockhart's leaving the army to take up the unlikely career of shipping agent was odd enough in itself. Mr. Lockhart taught his daughter himself in the evenings and let her do as she pleased during the day. As a result, her knowledge of English literature, French, history, art and music was non-existent. But she had a thorough grounding in the principles of military tactics and bookkeeping, a close acquaintance with the affairs of the stock market, and a working knowledge of Hindustani. Furthermore, she could ride well, though her pony would not agree to the Cossack procedure, and for her 14th birthday, her father had bought her a little Belgian pistol, the one she carried everywhere, and taught her to shoot. She was now nearly as good a shot as her mother. She was solitary, but perfectly happy. The only blight on her childhood was the nightmare. This came to her once or twice a year. She would feel herself suffocating in intolerable heat. The darkness was intense, and somewhere nearby a man's voice was screaming in terrible agony. Then out of the darkness a flickering light would appear, like a candle held by someone hurrying towards her, and another voice would cry, "Look, look at him, dear God, look!" But she did not want to look. It was the last thing in the world she wanted to do. And that was the point at which she woke up, drenched in perspiration, suffocating and sobbing with fear. Her father would come running and calm her down, and presently she would sleep again, but it took a day or so for her to feel free of it. Then came her father's voyage and the weeks of separation, and finally the telegram of his death. At once her father's lawyer, Mr. Temple, had taken charge. The house in Norwood was shut up, the servants paid off, the pony sold. It seemed that there was some irregularity in her father's will or in the trust he had set up, and that Sally was consequently going to be much poorer than anyone had thought. She was placed in the care of her father's second cousin, Mrs. Rees, and there she had lived until this morning when the letter came. She thought until she had opened it that it must be from the Dutch agent, Mr. Van Eden, but the paper was torn and the writing clumsy and childlike. Surely no European businessman would write like that. Besides, it was unsigned. She had gone to her father's office in the hope that someone there would know what it meant, and she had found that someone did. She went back to Peveril Square, She did not think of it as home, on the threepenny omnibus, and prepared to face Mrs. Rees. She had not been given a key to the house. This was one of Mrs. Rees's ways of making her feel unwelcome. She had to ring the bell every time she had wanted to come in, and the maid who admitted her did so always with the air of having been interrupted in some important task. "Mrs. Rees is in the drawing room, miss," she said primly. "She says you're to go in and see her the minute you get in." Sally found the lady seated by a thin fire, reading a volume of her late husband's sermons. She did not look up when Sally entered, and Sally looked down at her faded gingery hair and loose dead white skin, loathing her. Mrs. Rees was not yet out of her 40s, but had found early in life that the role of an aged tyrant suited her well, and played it for all it was worth. She acted as if she were a frail 70. She had never in her life lifted a finger for herself or had a single kind thought for others, and she welcomed Sally's presence only for the chance it gave her to bully. Sally stood by the fire and waited, and finally spoke. "I'm sorry I'm late, Mrs. Rees, but Oh, Aunt Caroline, said the lady irritably. "I have been told by my lawyers that I am your aunt. I did not expect it, I did not seek it, but I shall not shrink from it." Her voice whined and creaked, thought Sally, and she would speak so slowly. "The maid said you wished to see me, Aunt Caroline. I have been applying myself with little success to the subject of your future. Do you intend to remain under my care forever, I wonder? Or would 5 years be sufficient? Or 10? I am merely trying to establish the scale of things. It is plain that you have no prospects, Veronica. I wonder if it had crossed your mind. What accomplishments have you?" Sally hated the name Veronica, but Mrs. Rees had said that Sally was a servant's name and refused to use it. She stood mute now, unable to think of a polite answer, and found her hands beginning to shake. "Miss Lockhart is endeavouring to communicate with me by means of thought alone, Ellen," said Mrs. Rees to the maid, who was standing piously inside the door, hands folded and eyes wide with innocence. "I am supposed to understand her without the intervention of language. My education, alas, did not prepare me for such a task. In my day we used words very frequently amongst ourselves. We spoke when we were spoken to, for instance." "I'm afraid I have no accomplishments, Aunt Caroline," said Sally in a low voice. "None but modesty, you mean to imply, or is modesty simply the first of a long list? Surely so excellent a gentleman as your late father would not have left you quite unprepared for life." Sally shook her head helplessly. The death of Mr. Higgs, and now this. "I thought so," said Mrs. Rees, glinting with a pale triumph. "So even the modest goal of governess is barred to you. We shall have to bend our thoughts to something yet more modest. Possibly one of my friends, Miss Tullet perhaps, or Mrs. Ringwood, could in charity find room for a lady's companion. I shall make inquiries among them. Ellen, you may bring the tea." The maid bobbed and left. Sally sat down heavy-hearted with the prospect of another evening of sarcasm and malice ahead of her, and the knowledge of mystery and danger outside. So that is the end of chapter 1.